This is Benoit, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. We organized a summer solstice fundraiser in support of Let's Share the Sun Foundation. I would like to thank our listeners, who we call our Mavericks, who attended. Your presence and generosity are helping bring energy security to families in Puerto Rico who rely on 24/7 electricity for critical medical needs. A special thank you to our incredible sponsors, Rosemar Investment Management, Polar Racking, Positive Deviancy, Renew Energy, and of course the Solar Maverick podcast for making this event possible. I will keep you updated on the next events that we organize. Let's get into it. This is Benoit Thanjan, host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm excited to share an incredible upcoming event that I'll be attending. WRISE, Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy, is celebrating its 20th anniversary gala on Thursday, June 20th in New York City. WRISE is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the participation and advancement of women in the renewable energy sector through mentoring programs, networking events, and career resources. They're building a more inclusive and empowered clean energy workforce. The gala is a powerful celebration of 20 years of impact and a chance to connect with leaders and change makers shaping the future of sustainable energy. Space is limited, so get your tickets now at WRISE 20th Anniversary Gala.rsvpify.com. We'll also have this on the notes of the podcast as well. Let's get into it.
We have this kind of almost absurd grid infrastructure where basically our entire electrical infrastructure is balanced on basically these almost like toothpicks, just are all around the entire country. And predictably, unpredictable times during the year, something will happen to break all of the toothpicks and send the whole thing into the mud. And then you have to go back and build an entire new forest, power poles, and rebuild the thing.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoit Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoit, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm really excited to have on this episode of the podcast Fox Swim, senior solar industry researcher for Aurora Solar. We're going to talk about a lot of interesting topics that are happening with state level solar policy and the new House proposed tax bill in the House of Representatives and how it could affect key incentives of the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022. Fox, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you making time and educating us on the rapidly changing solar landscape when it comes to state level and federal level policy.
Thank you for having me, Benoit.
Anytime. It would be great, Fox, if you could start off and talk about, if our audience is not familiar with Aurora Solar, and also like specifically in your role at the company.
Yeah, so Aurora Solar is a pretty well-known sales and a solar design software. We work all around the country. We're available all around the country and all around the world, helping people to present as accurate information about solar installations and to help put solar on roofs all over the world. For myself, I joke my role as a professional info dumper. I learn things and then I tell people about those things. My specific area of expertise is solar policy, as we're talking about right now, as well as solar hardware modeling and utility rates, especially as relates to solar. So like all of the different ins and outs of utility policy and exports and things like that.
That's amazing. I mean, obviously it takes a lot of different types of skill sets to be an expert. Policy, energy rates. I think you said hardware modeling as well. So I'm really excited because I think you could bring like a unique perspective. And as you know, like there's so much that's changing. I think a lot of the solar industry obviously is very familiar with the Aurora Solar and their software. And, I'm a customer of Aurora, so very familiar, obviously, with the software platform. Can you talk about, it's interesting because there's been so much going on in the industry. How are like anti-solar policy in states like California with AB 942, Florida, Texas, shaping the national energy landscape? And do you think there's a pattern emerging as well? Because we're also seeing this in other states as well, which I find this to be unique because solar is the cheapest and obviously renewable resource that's out there and the fastest to come online. So it's curious to see this happening.
I think there's a couple different questions in there, but like especially prior to the OBBB, which I think we're going to talk more in detail about later. But the state policy landscape has really shaped a lot of the solar rollout in the United States, especially in the past 3 or 4 years. And really what I've seen, just looking holistically at the policy landscape, is there's a strong tension between utility companies wanting to centralize solar installation and homeowners and community groups and environmental groups wanting to create a more sustainable distributed energy generation grid. And I mean, really, it's a lot of what we've seen prior to 2025 isn't so much an opposition to solar itself as a conflict around how the solar rollout is going to happen. Utility companies, because their businesses, because of how their model works, are ultimately agnostic as to how electricity is generated. They just want to be able to control the method of generation so then they can sell it. And really, like looking at California, that feels in many ways a microcosm of that, as we've seen much more restrictive policies going into place that are lopsidedly restrictive against residential and the sort of the DER, or sometimes it's called distributed energy resources, that basically make it harder to do those, or at least less economically friendly to do those resources. And I think that in many areas of the United States, they follow California's lead. There's a very strong signal that often is said is as California goes, so goes the nation, especially around infrastructure policy and environmental policy. And I think we've seen that as California has rolled out the net metering successor tariff, which is also called NEM3, which is also called a net billing tariff. It goes by a lot of different names. You see that idea rolling out all over the country. And you're not seeing at that level of impact. Say the Arizona utilities have been very innovative in terms of how they're doing disincentivizing residential solar and trying to centralize their grids. But their policy, the way they've been doing it, hasn't taken as much of a hold across the rest of the country. And I mean, with acknowledging the bias of I work for a company whose our bread and butter is promoting residential solar. But that said, I also do believe that distributed solar is ultimately the better way forward into the future. Because as we've seen throughout the past decade or so, climate change induced weather events, as well as just the wearing of time on our grid infrastructure, is creating more and more grid instability. And that's wearing on the centralized grid model. People are experiencing more and more blackouts. People are experiencing more and more, and it's getting more and more difficult and expensive to maintain that infrastructure. Whereas if we had a more microgrid-oriented distributed energy structure, that level of disruption would be minimized, especially if we really leaned into that.
Definitely agree with you about that. That's a great point. And I was just going to say too, like you mentioned obviously about California, about NEM3. Obviously there's AB 942. If our audience is not familiar, if you could talk about AB 942 and what's changed, because I think there's been changes in what the potential regulation might be. And
yeah, so AB 942 is basically the latest or the latest step in the various utility companies' attempts to centralize the grid infrastructure. And basically what it did when it was introduced was it made it so that it would basically cancel the NEM2 grandfathered contracts and basically force everyone onto the NEM3 net billing tariff, which would have been extremely devastating and extremely unfair to anyone who had an NEM2 installations, because if for no other reason, because the way you design an NEM to be economical is very different than you design an NEM3 system to be economical, because of the different ways the export policies are structured. And also, like, these people signed, a contract with the utility company that mandated various responsibilities and benefits going both directions for the utility company. And then, based on the understanding that the contract was ironclad, they went and signed, various loan agreements or financing agreements with various loan providers or whomever. And I'm going to say that it's almost certain that, those loan providers would not have let the homeowners out of their loan, even if solar policy or their array suddenly produced significantly less power. And that would have been essentially, it would have screwed people over, if I can say that on the podcast right now. And that got changed. There was not maybe for the most altruistic reasons, or in committee, it was pointed out that almost certain people, coalition of homeowners, would bring suit against state of California for wrongful termination of contract, and they would probably win. And so the bill got changed. And now it says, or now the current bill that's going to be voted on possibly today, probably next week, says that house is sold. When the house that the system is sitting on is sold, then if it is an NEM or NEM2 grandfathered system, you lose the grandfathered status and it becomes an NEM3 system. And that's still not good because, that's also, breaking the contract as well. In many cases, it would make the sale of the house more complicated because the homeowner or the system owner is left with kind of a no-win situation with either, if they still have a balance of that loan that they have to sell, that they have to pay off, they either just have to eat the loan during the process of the house sale, or they have to convince the home buyer to take over the loan with the understanding that the solar system isn't going to be able to cover the payments of the loan nearly as well as it did for the original installer because it's an NEM3 system, and almost certainly there's not the correct storage infrastructure or the correct hardware to be able to do the energy arbitrage requirements that you have to do to be able to have a viable system under NEM3. So it would kind of make the solar array a liability for anyone trying to sell a grandfathered system moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great way of explaining it. I mean, it's frustrating because obviously residential solar customers, obviously you mentioned banks, have committed to it based on, what NEM program, right, it was under. And then now, obviously it's a lot better now, but still, it's going to make it more challenging, as you mentioned, to sell it to another homeowner. And you're still kind of breaking the contract when you originally signed it. So that creates uncertainty in the future when people look at, unfortunately, California solar market going forward.
And zooming out a little bit more broadly, I guess just a brief mention, there is also another provision in AB 942 which disqualifies anyone who has a solar array on their roof from receiving the California climate credit, which amounts to about $150 per year of credit on the account, and really honestly just feels kind of punitive. It's just they're taking another little thing away. There's not really any justification that I've seen. It's just we're just going to take this away too because we can. And that's a thing. But zooming out a little bit here, one of the things that I'm wondering about and that I'm hoping that the narrative can be shifted here is for all utility companies are trying to stop distributed energy solar on the grid. It's also helpful for them because solar arrays generate electricity, especially for self-consumption systems, and reduces the grid load overall. And it feels like a lot of utility companies have been leaning really heavily on federal incentive programs to basically make up for their own shortcomings. And now that a lot of the federal incentive programs look like they're going away, that I think the conversation has to shift, especially at the state level, to how can the states support the energy build out in their jurisdictions, because we can't lean on the federal programs anymore.
That's really interesting perspective, Fox. I think you're right. They're going to have to be creative, right? And they have to accept more distributed generation because it's the cheapest way to handle the infrastructure. And as we all know, the energy demand is going to increase exponentially and prices are continue to go up. And as prices continue to go up, your ratepayer is going to ask why is this happening, right? And you can't blaming other, it's interesting listening to some states, they blame solar for it, which is frustrating. And I don't know if you want to get into the community solar program that California had with the 7 gigawatts that wasn't approved in May of 2024, which they had a net metering tariff similar to New York to basically compensate for the externalities that you're talking about, the benefits that the grid would have with distributed community solar projects of, 5 megawatts AC or below. I was very surprised that it wasn't passed because, it's all private investment. It creates $15 million per, they say, this is what CCSA came out with, $15 million of economic opportunity for one community solar project. But I'm not surprised because at the end of the day, the California PUC obviously is not motivated to change their business model, unfortunately, as you've been saying, in a nicer way, and they're just comfortable to do what they've done all the time. But as we all know, the utility of the future has to adapt because, there's going to be blackouts and more extreme weather events, especially in California. And there needs to be obviously infrastructure upgrades. But as you mentioned, like distributed generation, microgrids, which I think it's a combination of everything. And obviously solar and residential solar is the cheapest and quickest to get online with the energy demand. So
one of the biggest parts of energy policy in this country that I feel needs to be reformed is like how we do public utility commissions. Like it's a very, very closed, very non-democratic system that results in public utility commissions being staffed primarily by utility company insiders and by people who are most interested in supporting the immediate needs of the utility companies and the immediate desires of the utility companies, and doesn't really have a way to have a voice for other people in the industry and for ratepayers and for people looking innovating forward into how the grid needs to be in the future, and instead is much more interested in preserving the status quo of the current grid. And like, I don't know exactly what that looks like. I think it might be helpful, if nothing else, if public utility commissions can be confirmed positions or maybe even elected positions, though that could also get fraught in other ways. But there definitely needs to be reform in that space. To make the status quo not quite so status quo.
that's a great point, Fox. And it's interesting. I don't know if I want to get so much into details, but it's basically like the utility has sort of a percentage rate of return. They add it to what they're doing. It depends, actually. It's a lot more complicated because each state is so unique in its own way. But I felt like California is like obviously, as you mentioned, the leader for everything that happens going forward. And I appreciate you talking about like what's happening in California. Which states are like taking a positive stance on protecting or expanding residential solar rights in response to this trend that we're seeing?
Yeah, by necessity, Hawaii has had to build out a lot of very incentivized to build out renewable infrastructure. And certainly there has been some problems with how they've done that. I think there's in many ways been the leader in a lot of the solar build out, in that kind of solar build out. And so, mistakes were made in some ways. But I think that because there is a point in the transition where you have to essentially make it incentivize much or more storage on your grid as you're incentivizing solar, because like the biggest downside of solar is that it only works when the sun is up, right? And so having an amount of storage capacity on your grid as well is really helpful. And like, it makes sense, especially in Hawaii's case, is that it's a series of islands, and you're relying on there's no coal in Hawaii. There's no natural gas in Hawaii. Everything has to be imported, but you don't have to import the sun. There's lots of sun in Hawaii. And so they've been really incentivized to build that out. I've see other states that I would call out as having done, I think it's Connecticut, was one of the first states to really roll out some of the distributed like virtual battery type programs. And I do think the virtual battery programs have been very successful and have been very beneficial to everyone, including the utility companies all over the grid. And I think that's been really helpful to see that rollout happen.
Obviously, there's been a lot of talk in the solar industry with the House of Representatives tax bill that was passed or proposed last Wednesday, and now is in the Senate. Can you talk about and everyone's obviously talking about this, what are the long-term risks to the solar industry based on this proposed tax bill?
I mean, I think there's sort of a paradox here where it's difficult to overstate the risks, but it's also easy to overstate the risks. Like, I don't think it's correct to say that this is going to destroy residential solar. I think this is going to create a realignment in the solar industry. And a lot of companies and a lot of organizations are going to contract or go out of business in ways that are extremely painful. It's a very unnecessary and honestly almost cruel hit to an industry that is vitally important to our nation. Speaking, like, as you were mentioning, like, electricity demand is soaring in the United States. We're having this, and it's not just like people are using more air conditioners and, fancy widgets in their house. Like, this is AI boom. This new wave of technological innovation is causing significant increase in demand on the grid. And if we throttle that, it will have a pretty direct effect of throttling that innovation boom. That said, I think the realignment, like, one of the things is interesting to me and that I look at in terms of where the solar industry is, where the footing as to where we're going, is looking at the example of Florida, which doesn't have great solar incentive policies. I believe I looked at an overall analysis, and last year, the average time to pay back for a solar loan in Florida was somewhere around 11 to 12 years, which is generally, not a great payback ratio. And yet, Florida was the number 2 in solar sales last year. And so you have to ask, well, why? It's because they got hit by 2 really massive hurricanes. And Florida gets hit by massive hurricanes quite a lot. We have this kind of almost absurd grid infrastructure where basically our entire electrical infrastructure is balanced on basically these almost like toothpicks, just are all around the entire country. And predictably, unpredictable times during the year, something will happen to break all of the toothpicks and send the whole thing into the mud. And then you have to go back and build an entire new forest of power poles and rebuild the thing. And in Florida, we're seeing essentially people getting tired of having to replace everything in their fridge every year, or tired of losing power and having to wait for an unknown amount of time before power is restored. And the lesson that I'm taking from this is that there is another motivation that inspires people to go solar besides just the more investment-oriented footing that the solar industry is on currently, and that is resiliency. People want to preserve their quality of life. People want to preserve the status quo of their operate and how they move in the world. We like the comforts that we have, and in many cases, sometimes those things that we call comforts are necessary. Like if you have breathing issues, you actually need air purifiers. If you live in a northern state, you really need to have a heater that works. And it doesn't really matter to you how that's powered. And, LIHEAP is taken apart. That's one of the things that is something that near and dear to my heart. When I was a couple decades ago as a poor college kid with a baby, I relied on LIHEAP in rural Kansas to be able to actually not freeze in the winter. And that program going away is going to be devastating for a lot of people. And renewable energy can help in situations like that. And I think that's where the solar industry has to shift, is in this next period, this next season of the solar industry, and the next twists and turns of the solar coaster, you could metaphorize it as, is to a footing of helping people to weather the economic storm that this one baleful bill creates.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Fox, that's a great point about resiliency. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And I think you're right. Like people who have experienced, obviously not having electricity or severe weather incidents, or in parts of the country where you need heating, like that's a huge part that maybe as an industry we should be educating. Part of me feels like also most Americans, we have not experienced like what other countries have experienced with their grid going down as much. And I think there's more of appreciation of that resilience. And I think also too, like we should be also talking about energy independence, right? Like people want to be independent from the grid if something does happen. That means like having residential, like solar and storage. And that's really great points. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Okay. And I mean, I think like taking a look at like one other thing I wanted to mention is going back to the idea of community solar. The other way that I think that these projects that the solar industry could take that would be beneficial and a long term to the United States as a whole is for communities they would need, for this to happen, states especially would need to be able to help and to incentivize and to provide assistance and support for making this happen. But we need to have community solar, like essentially community solar microgrid type programs, communities that are more isolated, especially in mountain areas or in, more rural communities, could benefit from community solar and community wind too. I think there's a mixed situation because solar is not ideal in every single situation, and it cannot carry an entire community in every single situation. And also, like a bright spot that I have that I'm looking at on the horizon is the fate of the GGRF funds. Right now, those are still locked up in the court, but I do believe that eventually those funds will get released, unless the current administration just decides to flagrantly break the law and literally rob a bank. That I think that those funds will be released, and those funds will provide a foundational support for a resiliency-focused pivot in the solar industry.
Yeah, definitely. And if people are not familiar with that fund, or like I know you're using the acronym, can you actually, it's what, greenhouse gases?
A greenhouse gas reduction fund.
That's fund, yeah.
And it's an enormous amount of money that's directed towards 3 programs: a Solar for All program, the National Clean Energy or Clean Investment Fund, and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. And basically, what these 3 programs were planned to do and were designed to do is basically create an enormous base of funds to create subsidized solar loans for low income, especially for low income and marginalized communities, as well as create a nonprofit solar financing industry, basically a series of nonprofit green banks whose mandate is to essentially provide a foundation with which to build a resiliency-minded solar rollout and green energy rollout in the United States.
Yeah, definitely. That's great to know that potentially, I know everyone's been focused on whether that money will come through, and that's great to hear that there's a high probability.
That's my belief. Like, the money has been committed, the money is earmarked. Like, the legal strategy that the administration is trying right now is certainly novel, but also is an act of desperation in many ways. I don't know, like, if people aren't aware of the ins and outs, what they're trying to do is literally charge the organizations who applied for GGRF grants and then were granted those funds, literally trying to charge them with criminal fraud, with the idea that then they could seize the GGRF funds as evidence. It's extremely transparent. Literally, the only evidence they've been able to give to the courts is one EPA employee offhandedly quoting Titanic about as terms of the speed at which the funds were allocated. That's all that they've been able to find. And the courts have not looked kindly upon the administration's attempt to use criminal law like that, and eventually, but the funds are still frozen. But I am hopeful, I'm optimistic that these funds will be released.
Yeah, definitely. You sharing your perspective on that, and that's really interesting. I didn't know about sort of the legal strategy of the executive branch of the United States, and then how difficult it will be for them to basically overturn earmark funding. So that's really interesting. I appreciate you talking about that. And then what kind of like planning or safeguards can solar companies take in case like IRA incentives are scaled back or eliminated?
I mean, it's one of those things, like, in one regard, there's a lot of stuff that companies should have been doing already. Like, this is one of the things, like, a lot of the actions that are happening right now were very clearly telegraphed in the Project 2025 documentation. And also, that said, like, many people, including myself, were taken off guard. Like, if you would have asked me this question 6 months ago or about the fate of the IRA, I would have told you there's no way they were going to try for legislative repeal of the IRA incentives, that would be too politically hazardous and difficult, that they would basically try to use, constitutionally dubious impoundment practices to try to stop this. And I was wrong, as were many people. But I think what people can do, what solar companies can do, is I think take a look at how they're selling, take a look at what their sales pitches, what their strategies are, really come to reckoning with the trust issue. There has been a persistent trust issue in the solar industry, and that's something like we're seeing a wave of like contractual language laws in various states, Texas, California, Rhode Island, a few others, that are basically mandating different policies that have to be in solar contracts just to kind of deal with some of the trust issues that have been happening. And like, that can't continue. solar companies need to clamp down on those practices. And at the same time, figure out where the need in the communities are for solar, like who actually needs solar, and where solar can be of most help, and then figure out how they can help solar get into that situation. I think this is going to be a difficult time to be a for-profit company, I think, because I think a lot of companies are going to need to operate basically on we just have to make it through to the next year, and basically operate almost as functional nonprofit to get through this particular solar winter that we're experiencing, and then educate people and educate communities on why the solar build out is important, especially as we start to see more grid infrastructure failures, especially as we start to see more, as electricity prices start to spike as a result of data center driven demand, and just the fact that trying to pivot back petroleum based fuels is going to spike energy prices all over the country, and making sure that people are very well aware of that, so that here in a year and change, when it's time to go to the ballot boxes again, we make decisions as a country that ensure we can actually have the country and the energy policies that we need to have to actually thrive and survive during climate change.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And you're right. It's going to be very challenging for-profit companies to, survive. We're going to see, I think, a lot of companies within the solar industry go out of business, and with the changing incentives, and then, basically a lowering of the incentives, and then obviously tariffs as well to create confusion too. And then all the things related to the supply chain and where the different items of the supply chain are coming. That creates a lot of uncertainty too. There's very nebulous language in the House of tax bill about foreign components within.
Are you referring to the FIOC language?
Yes, I'm referring to that. Yes.
Yeah, I've been assuming about the FIOC language, and what I think others have been assuming. I guess for listeners who aren't aware, FIOC means foreign entities of concern. And it's essentially a set of sourcing restrictions that is placed on technology that the government wants to incentivize, but at least traditionally has been associated with things that are considered to be issues of national security. So most recently, the CHIPS Act has a very FIOC restrictions in it. So generally, things that I've read is that it's probably FIOC itself is a term that is defined by a separate national security law, but that basically defines it as any company or individual that is associated with the governments of Russia, North Korea, Iran, or China, and sort of associated, especially in terms of a company, is any amount of investment in that company or board makeup in that company rises above 20%. If you have 10 board members and 3 of them are Chinese nationals or are associated with the Chinese government in a particular way. And to be clear, this is targeting China. If there is a strong thread of the solar import policy that flows through Iran, I'm not aware of it, and I don't think anyone else is aware of it either. So this is very clearly targeted against China, for which a significant amount of the renewable energy, especially batteries and especially raw materials, flow through. And it's facially absurd. A solar panel is not going to hack. There's, I can see the justification for AI chips and for things like that, but this is very much a punitive and results in a functional appeal of even some of the policies which are technically going to continue for a little bit, like 48E and 48X and 45Y. It's basically a repeal of those because there are no batteries on the market today that meet FIOC requirements.
Yeah, that is interesting insights. And, it's interesting too. You mentioned basically with the step downs and obviously having that language in there, they could potentially, the government say it's null, the incentive based on just, that. And as everything, especially when you talk about cells and wafers, that all comes from China. We don't have this right now in the US. Say we're trying to promote.
Yeah. The extreme difficulty of it as well is that it's not just any part of the manufacturing chain comes from China. And something, I think the figures I looked at, something like 80 to 90% of semiconductor grade polysilicon comes from China, from nothing else. That's where the largest deposits of silicon are. It's very much designed to quickly and quietly crush the renewable energy boom because party in power right now has a philosophical desire to essentially to petroleum generation is in their mind morally good. Like that's really the only way that I can describe it. Like it's almost like a religious mindset that like this is how we should be doing things and everything else is bad. There is no economic or structural argument for why we're trying to bring back coal. Like it makes no sense in any of those fields. But if you look at it from the perspective of it's almost like a quasi-religious philosophy that we have to go back to or to go back to some sort of a mythical golden age of when we were polluting the air and causing acid rain or something to that effect. That's why they're trying to kind of do all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting point. And obviously, oil and gas lobbyists are some of the biggest lobbyists for, presidential campaigns. So obviously, they're supporting their special interest as well. So that's interesting perspective. I feel like we could talk about this for a really long time because there's just so many different layers to this. But I was going to change topics and actually talk about solar snapshot for
Sure.
2005. Can you share, Fox, like the major insights from that report?
I mean, like major insights that we put out, like it very much shows, and like it's one of those things that looking at the solar snapshot as to where we are now is like it's a picture of how good the solar economy was. And I think one of the things that we can take away from that, the solar industry certainly had some problems. There were certainly some growth pains, especially around trust issues and especially around dealing with utility companies. But the solar industry has been a vital and extremely popular and extremely vital part of the energy of the 21st century. And I think that it's easy, especially as the political and media environment that we live in, to kind of lose track of what was true. And like this report really provides a really good and really evidence-based snapshot of, yeah, this economy that existed pre all of the OBBB stuff and things like that has been really, really good and vital and popular in the United States. And I think that one of the things that I would advise in many ways of using this, what people can do with this report, what people can use this information for, is solar companies and renewable energy companies, there is no incentive to not be political at this point. To basically to get involved in the political process in your municipalities, in your states, and like we have data that is broke down by region and broke down by different demographic types within that report, and use that to talk to your elected representatives and say, hey, this is really important to these specific people in this specific area, and this is why you need to support this, and to advocate for the continued growth and in some areas survival of our industry.
Yeah, that's a great point. We all have to, especially now more than ever, really talk to our representatives and educate them about what's happening and the opportunity. And yeah, I appreciate you explaining that. Also, can you talk about Aurora's recent customer advocacy work?
Yeah, so we've been working with SIA and we've been working with CALSA quite a bit. I was actually in Sacramento here at the beginning of the week, helping out with the lobbying efforts there to encourage the representatives and senators who are people. We kind of forget sometimes that all of the people involved here are actually people. They're not just like caricatures or weird cartoon characters that dance around on our screens. But we've been involved. We've been leveraging our access, leveraging our data that we have, the connections that we have to show up for the solar industry as a whole, to show up for our customers, to show up for the renewable energy transition, and to provide hard, real, truthful data to show that this is necessary, that our industry is vital to how the grid and how our country needs to meet the challenges of climate change and meet the challenges of this next century.
Yeah, definitely. Advocacy is so big in obviously our industry. And I appreciate all the work that you're doing and partnering with obviously the other major industry groups and, obviously going to Sacramento and for them to see that, they're people and you communicating with them the benefits of solar. So I really appreciate you doing that, Fox. This has been an amazing interview. I really appreciate the time that you made today. I know things are really busy with everything that's going on. If our audience, who we call Mavericks because it's the Solar Maverick podcast, are interested in learning more about Aurora Solar, or they would like to learn more about you, what's the best way they could do that?
I mean, to learn about Aurora Solar, you can go to our website. You can take a look at our documentation. You can ask for demonstrations. To learn about me, I mean, I've been giving interviews to various organizations as part of our advocacy work. I've been giving various interviews all over the country. I've talked to Canary Media and PV Magazine and a variety of others. So look for me. I bet if you did a clever Google search, you'd probably find information about me.
We'll also put in the show notes like links to those interviews as well.
Also, one last thing that I would like to put out there in terms of giving a signal boost. So in terms of state policy, there is a bill that I'm tracking that is actually good for the solar industry. Many people haven't been aware of, so I want to give a good signal boost to, for some reason, my notes aren't pulling up here, but it's in North Carolina, and it's a bill that would reinstate a tax credit program that used to exist but doesn't exist anymore, and would basically create a state-funded residential ITC incentive in North Carolina. And to me, that feels like a very important thing to have because, I mean, ultimately states are going to need to pick up some where the national government is stepping back. And that feels like something good to signal boost here.
Yeah, that's great to signal boost. I'm excited to hear about the North Carolina state tax credit, which I was familiar with when they had that a few years ago. And I appreciate, Fox, you being on the podcast. I mean, this is providing a lot of great insights, educating our community, and also providing them as well to be advocates of obviously solar. And I appreciate you making time. Thanks for being on the Solar Maverick Pod.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a wonderful weekend.
You too as well. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Renew Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@renewenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoit Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.